Welcome to Setting Boundaries, Part 3. This is the third part in our self-care series about sustainable educator self-care, doing things in our lives beyond bubble baths through everything that we're expected to do and learning how to set those boundaries. In Part 1, we introduced the series, and then last week in Part 2, we talked about how you can set boundaries at work, knowing your rights, and how to navigate through that in a professional manner, and also just protecting yourself at work. This week, we're going to jump into setting boundaries outside of work, because if you're an educator, you know that most of the time work is being taken home. You're doing stuff in the evenings, on the weekends, throughout the summer, on your breaks, during Christmas, during spring break, that it seems like it's nonstop. So this week we're really going to focus in on how to set those boundaries outside of work, when it's time to clock out, when it's time to call it a day. If you didn't get your free Setting Boundaries workbook last week, you can always go down into the description of this video and grab a copy of that for yourself. So let's go ahead and get started for our setting boundaries outside of work. That's what we're going to be looking at today. So as we start, we're going to dive in and we're going to dispel another myth. And this myth is a huge one that's pressed upon educators to guilt them into doing a whole lot more than should be expected of any person. And that myth is that you do not care about your students or your school community if you clock out at the end of the workday. The truth is, you don't have to be on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You are more than an educator. You didn't give your life to being an educator and vow to only just be that. You are an educator, but you're more than just an educator. You deserve your own time. You're a person. You deserve to have more than just your job dominating your time. And a tired teacher isn't an effective teacher. So the myth that you have to wear yourself out all of the time or you don't care, that's what makes you a good teacher, is really counterproductive, because when you're exhausted, you're not effective. When working with educators, I find that it is critical to dispel this myth in particular. That is because you will be taken advantage of, you will miss out on so much, and you will have regret if you buy into that myth that you must always be on, you must always be available, that the workload has to be so much that if you're caught up, you're not really caught up. Here, let me give you some more to do. Oh, you handled that? I'm going to throw more on your plate. That's not okay. And if we set good boundaries, we can reclaim our time with our families, our friends, traveling, whatever it is we like to do in our lives and that we have a right to do in our lives. Just because you're an educator, it does not mean that you signed up to give yourself to being an educator all the time. If we think about the medical profession, doctors have their working hours. My husband's in the medical profession. I see this all the time. You have your working hours. And sometimes there may be times when they're on call and they work, outside of their normal hours, their clinical hours or their surgical hours, and they might be on call. There may be some adjusting of shifts. But they're not constantly seeing patients all the time, every day. Their clinic doesn't shut down and they say, I'm going to see more patients. If it's not their weekend to be on call, or if they don't work on the weekend, or whatever their day off is, they're not like, you know what? Sorry, fam, I'm not going to spend time with you today. I'm going to go into the office and see more patients. They have times when they do that, and I'm sure there are times when they do work outside of their, clinical hours, and there are things that they do on the back end that we don't see. But they still take vacations, they still spend time with their family, and nobody tells them that they don't care about their patients and that they're bad doctors because they do those things. Well, you know what? The same thing applies to an educator. Why shouldn't you be able to have time to go to the gym every day if you want to? Why shouldn't you be able to have time to just sit on your porch and drink a cup of coffee without having a computer in front of you? And then told you don't care about your students, you don't care about your school community. If you really cared, you would do even more, right? We're told that a lot. And that's a myth. You can care about your students and your community and still have a life and still set boundaries and take vacations and not always be doing something for your classroom. And so, just like any other profession gets that same respect, gets that same acknowledgement, our profession should get that too. But we have to learn for ourselves to set boundaries. Because if we don't set those boundaries, then we will be taken advantage of outside of our working hours. So when we talk about setting boundaries, we're going to be looking at boundaries when we're off. So that's our focus. So we started with just dispelling that myth that you have to be on all the time. So now let's talk about creating some of those boundaries when you're off the clock. So here's the myth. To be an effective educator, you must work evenings, weekends, and holidays. Because if you're not doing that, then you're really dropping the ball on what needs to be done with your class and things for your students. That is a myth. To start setting boundaries outside of work, you need to evaluate your time first. That's step one, evaluating your time. So what are you spending your time doing? Are you taking work home and doing grading? Are you getting on the computer and answering emails? Are you making new lessons? And that's just on the weekday evenings. On Saturdays, are you waking up and printing and cutting and laminating and preparing? I have been guilty of doing that, of spending a whole entire weekend doing that, creating resources, spending my time prepping stations or lessons or activities, all outside of your working time, using your own resources in your own home. While everything in your house is going on around you, you're there, but you're not really there. Staying up late, missing meals, not taking care of yourself because you're sitting down all the time. Maybe you're not getting up and moving. Just missing your favorite TV show that you really love and enjoy because you're busy grading or replying to parents or replying to emails or working on the next committee item. So you really need to evaluate your time. What are you doing outside of work? And what kind of time is it taking from your life? So that's step one. What are you doing during those off contract hours when it comes to work stuff? Then you need to think about consolidating. So you've evaluated your time, you know what you're doing when you're not actually at work. Now it's time to start thinking, how can I consolidate some of these things? And not only consolidating them outside of work, but consolidating them so that they can be done during contracted hours. We will be talking a little bit more about consolidating further on in this portion of the series and kind of how you getting to setting boundaries and consolidating things. But what can you consolidate to give yourself more time? So the first thing I'm going to speak of is I used to bring home stacks and stacks of paper to grade. My kids never got instant feedback. And why was that? Because the directive at school was to always be on. You should always be teaching. There should never be one moment where you're not doing anything or your kids aren't doing anything that's going forward. And finally, I thought to myself, if I'm grading papers late, if I'm not getting instant feedback, if my kids don't know, where they're struggling or where they're doing really great, if they don't have that, if I can't give them that feedback, then what's the point? So I just kind of did something that most people would call rebellious, but what I called was best for my students. And every time we did an activity or an assignment, I would have them come to me as they finished one by one, and we would look at it and go over it, and I'd give them feedback. Bam! They got a grade right there, and I had my grade book pulled up on my computer next to me, and I could just type in their grade. Or if they needed to go over it again, and I said, go try again, so that they had some feedback and they knew where they made their mistakes and they made some corrections, and they would bring it back to me. But as soon as we were done that whole feedback process and improvement process, that grade book was up and those grades were in, and my students knew right away and they could take it with them right away. I no longer had to bring that stuff home. I consolidated something. Did it go against the grain of what was expected of me? It did. But if we think about best practice tells us instant feedback. And I can't be teaching a whole group and giving instant feedback. I had kids working, there were things that they could go and do while they were waiting, but for every assignment, every child in my class got instant real feedback for whatever it was. It could, if it was routines, if it was a new lesson, if it was writing assignment, whatever it was, time was allotted, not after school, to write notes on their paper about that, give them feedback and hand it back and has to go back and forth. I consolidated that time and we did it all together. And my kids had meaningful things that they could work on while they were waiting to come to me. Or, there's a lot of other ways that I did that, and I can talk about that later. But the fact is, I consolidated because I evaluated the fact that I was literally bringing home carts full of papers that I didn't have time to grade or give feedback on in class home, and trying to work on that. And I always felt behind in that area. And a lot of educators feel behind in that area. But I consolidated. I thought outside of the box. And then I thought to myself, you know what? If my admin has anything to say about it, I'm just going to let them know this is why I'm doing it. Because I want my students to have good instant feedback. And it also was a boundary I set that this is a work function that should happen at work. This is not a work function that should happen after hours. Feedback should be happening in the classroom. And so that was a boundary that I set. So think about it. What are you doing? Evaluate your time. And what can you consolidate? What things are you doing at home that really should be being done during classroom time, in the classroom with our students? So we evaluate our time. We can consolidate things. But you know what else we can do? We can eliminate things. And that one was also a really big one for me, was eliminating things, because there are things that sometimes we're asked to do that really aren't necessary. So going through and thinking about what can we eliminate. So when we think about eliminating, it's hard because there's a lot of things that are asked of or required of us, and you have to go through and you have to really think, what can I eliminate? Where is more bang for my buck? Because a lot of things that I was doing in planning, I was doing those things because it was a new trend that sounded pretty and they wanted to have it done in the classrooms. But do I really have time for that? Is it really bringing any kind of benefit to my students? So what can I eliminate? What is not as important? So if anybody knows me, I love having a completely organized, matching, cute classroom. Like, I love that. But I was spending a lot of time creating the cutest bulletin boards. And a lot of that creation happened, of course, once school was over and I was staying at school past my time, putting up new paper and doing all this and doing all that. You know what? I eliminated that. I made a nice, pretty board outside my classroom that was very neutral and basic. And I posted student work because that was important. I eliminated the fluff of things that went on my board all the time. It was just something very basic. For example, behind me, it was something kind of like that. I had a little bit of decoration on there and it stayed the whole year, but the real focus was putting up new student work when they were doing things or student projects on my board, instead of feeling the need to change it from, teal at the beginning of the year to yellow or orange when it was fall to green or red when it was winter to blue and this, and always change. That took too much time. So I eliminated the whole I have to change it all the time thing because that happened after hours. There's no time to do that during the school day. And I simplified it and I eliminated the pressure or need to always have to have something new that took, hours, and then gathering supplies and buying supplies and cutting the stuff out and doing all this stuff because that also took time that I was doing at home because then I'd bring everything and, put it up after school. Now, that's something you like and you enjoy to do and you don't want to eliminate that. I'm not telling you you have to. But what I am saying is eliminate things that don't bring value for yourself. So think about your students, think about your classroom, and think about the time it takes after work or when you're off to do. And if it's not bringing value, then eliminate it. Get rid of it. The value for me of the bulletin board was my students' work. That was the value. All that extra little stuff that I was putting on it didn't really add value. My students weren't thrilled to see a big tree that I had made. They were thrilled to see their work displayed and shown off for all to see. So I eliminated a lot of the fluff that I put into stuff, which freed up a lot more of my time after work. And then lastly, just let go. Sometimes we just have to let it go. It's not possible. It's not going to get done. And we have to be able to just let it go. It's very hard to let go sometimes. There are things that we really want to have happen, and we just have to let it go. We have to say, you know what, this isn't worth it. I am a teachers pay teachers. I'm addicted to teachers pay teachers. Anytime a new cool center comes out, I just want it. I want it for my kids. I want a new game. But you know what? I have to just let that go. I have what they need. I know what's engaging. I've spent years and years and years cultivating resources, making resources. I need to let go of the fact that I always have to get the next new thing. Because I don't. It just takes extra time. So I can use what I have. So that I can let go of. Or just other things to let go of. Are you going to really grade everything when you're lesson planning? I've known that it's like there has to be an assignment and a grade for every single lesson I do. Does there? Really? Or could there be some good class discussion that you build on and, maybe on day 3 you do something that you're going to grade. Like really grade and use as a grade. So what can you let go of? Do you need to copy packets? Is that something your students really need? I don't know. Is it beneficial to them, or can you just let it go? What can you let go of when you come home? Here's one that's really easy. Answering email. Let it go. I will answer you when I get to work tomorrow. After work, I'm going to let go of answering additional emails. I'm going to let go of looking at my work email on the weekend and then trying to do a task that you're giving me to do on the weekend. I'm letting that go. That's a boundary. Just let it go. It'll still be there Monday morning. But sometimes it's hard to let certain things go. But what are some things that you can let go of that aren't going to be detrimental to your students? It's not going to be the end of the world. Or you know what? Sometimes the asks are just too much. You have to let go. Sarah posted a beautiful teacher tip about what balls are glass and what balls are rubber. And that goes straight to letting it go. Go back, check it out, and she'll explain it to you. If it's a rubber ball, let it go. You can let go. So you might be saying, that sounds all fine and good, and I'm not going to work after work, but I still need to get things done, and it's still a lot of work, and there really isn't enough time in the day. And that's true. There really isn't enough time in the day. But we can start by being realistic in setting our boundaries, and then we can grow those boundaries. So instead of a myth, how about a fact? The fact is, you cannot get to where you want to be with boundaries all at one time. You're not going to be able to completely reclaim your time in one day. That's just a fact. If you have poor boundaries right now when it comes to what you do outside of work, you're going to have to systematically tackle them. So we shouldn't work outside of our working hours. If we do, it should be as low as possible. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that I never do work outside of my contracted hours and that I always get it done during the day and everything's perfect. But what I can tell you is that I started setting boundaries. I started doing those things, evaluating my time, consolidating, eliminating, and letting go of some things. And I'm on track to a place where I don't spend every day and every weekend doing work stuff. There are times that it does call for it, or there are times that I've set aside because I know it is impossible to get these things done at work, unfortunately, because they do not give us the time during our contracted hours to accomplish everything that is asked of us. So I'm not going to sit here and tell you some kind of, magical world where you're never going to do anything when you're off work. But what I am going to say is you can greatly reduce it. You can systematically work to a way where within a boundary you set is when you do that work. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. But if you have crazy, unbalanced things going on right now where you're constantly working, just know you have to be realistic. It's unrealistic to say, I'm never going to work after I'm off. I'm never going to work on a weekend starting today, because you don't have the systems in place to do that. If you did, you wouldn't be working so much outside of work. And that's okay, and that's the point of this series, is let's get to that place. How do we get to that place? So we're going to look at how you can strategically start setting boundaries and scale up to where you have a more balanced life as an educator, and to where you have boundaries that you can stick to. One of the biggest mistakes that I see educators make is they say, next year I'm not doing all this. I am going to clock out and go home, and I'm not showing up early, and I'm never doing anything on the weekend. Then they go into the next year with that mindset, and it doesn't work out for them, and they feel like it's a failure, and they feel like it's impossible, and so they never try again to set boundaries outside of work. So if we do this systematically, and if we do this in a way that it builds up, now it's sustainable, and now it's manageable, and now you know what works and what doesn't work and what adjustments can be made, and now you can control your time, because that's the big thing. With setting boundaries outside of work, this is meant for you to control your time. You get to decide. When will I do something after work? Won't I? What will I do? What won't I do? So let's look at how to begin setting boundaries. You have to start somewhere. So there's a myth that setting boundaries means you're not a team player. And I really wanted to bring this myth to light because I've heard and seen it a lot. So what have I heard and seen? You're comparing yourself to your teammates or coworkers because there's some jealousy, resentment, or anger that you think you do more and contribute more because you see them posting pictures of themselves taking vacations or having fun on the weekend while you're in front of your computer doing stuff, and you're like, I don't think that's fair, and I'm a harder worker and I care more and they don't do as much. So we as educators need to stop hating on one another. You can't be mad because your coworker has a boundary. And if they have boundaries, it doesn't mean they're not a team player. And if you begin to set boundaries, it doesn't mean you're not a team player. It doesn't mean you're less of an educator if you have boundaries, and you're more of an educator if you don't. We have to change that mindset within ourselves because it's kind of pressed upon us by society and, you know, sometimes leadership or other teachers. We need to take that myth and dispel it right away, and we need to look within ourselves and say, oh my gosh, have I been guilty of that? Have I been guilty of judging my coworker, thinking, you know, I'm over here doing work that I'm sharing with the team. When are they doing the work that they're sharing with the team? As long as at the end of the day, everybody has what they need and work's getting done, if they're doing it within their boundaries, that's their right, and you should have your boundary too. You should have set that boundary too. So we need to get away from putting each other down for not setting boundaries, for shaming other teachers who aren't willing to go the extra mile and give their whole selves, and that makes them important, and I have a boundary so I'm not. And changing that culture and that mindset starts with teachers first. It starts with us. That we celebrate teachers. Like, yes, take your weekend. You worked so hard this week. You deserve it. We need to celebrate each other for the boundaries that we set and dispel that myth that you're not a team player or that you don't care and all that stuff. You're not part of the team because you're not giving. Maybe that they found a way to give it within their contract hours, what you're trying to do right now. How can I give and be effective within my contract hours, within these boundaries, not doing stuff outside of work? So let's really let that myth go and just focus on setting boundaries and being effective teachers. All right, so how do we start this? We got to start somewhere. And we start small. The biggest thing that you can do in setting boundaries is to start small. The smallest step I ever took when setting boundaries as an educator was let me get it. Here's my phone. I removed my work email from my phone. Y'all know how we all have Outlook on our phone? And we see the notifications come, and then we feel the constant need to look, and then it says, oh, we need these spreadsheets filled out by Monday, and the email was sent at 5 o'clock on Friday, and then you feel the need to have to go in there and get that work done on your weekend. Well, guess what? If it's not on my phone and I'm not opening my computer, I can't see it. That's my boundary. I took my work email off my phone. That was the very first small boundary I ever set. And it freed me from feeling the need to go in there and do stuff that was sent to me after contracted hours. It helped me to eliminate the thought of work, because sometimes we can be boggled down just by the thought or the pressure or the stress that work is there. It was a really great way for me to disconnect and be fully present in what I was doing outside of work. So I no longer have my work Outlook on my phone, and I haven't for some time, and it was the smallest but most freeing step I took, and it was an easy step because it was a small step. It may not be easy to say I'm never going to work at home. That might not be realistic, and that's a pretty big step. But that was one small step that I was able to take, is taking that email off of my phone. So when you're getting started on this journey, what's a small step that you can take? The next thing that you want to do is enlist an accountability partner. Somebody who's not going to let you backslide into old habits. Let's face it, some of the things that we do outside of working hours are habit, such as checking email, filling out spreadsheets, doing grades. They're just things that we do out of habit. And when you start setting boundaries, I know I felt this for myself. I was like, I feel like there's something I should be doing. I don't feel like I'm doing anything. And so I started to have all these feelings inside, and I needed somebody to help hold me accountable. And so my first small step was removing that work email. My next small step was saying, after 6 o'clock every day, 6 o'clock is my cutoff point, because there were like I would work from the time I woke up to the time I went home, basically until it was like, oh my gosh, it's 10 o'clock. I'm kind of an early to bed person. It's 10 o'clock. I need to, shower and get into bed. So my computer went away when it was time to get ready to go to bed. I would be eating in front of my computer. So once I established my boundary of no email on my phone, my next boundary was to shut my computer no matter what at 6 p.m. every day. And it was no matter if my project was finished. And if anybody knows me really well, I cannot stand unfinished products. Like if I'm really in depth into creating a lesson plan or an activity, I cannot stop until it's done. And if that means going until 10, 11 o'clock at night, that's what I would do. But I had to set a boundary for myself. And so I said, you know what? At 6 o'clock, I'm closing this laptop and I am not opening it again until the morning. It is going into my bag and I'm not going to look at it. And that was really hard for me. And I needed some accountability. It's easy to say that's what you're going to do. It's hard sometimes to follow through. And so there'd be days I'm talking to Sarah and I'm on the phone and we're talking about some things and she hears me typing and it's like 6:15, 6:30 and she's like, well, what are you doing? And I was like, oh, I'm just finishing this thing up real quick. And she'd be like, you said you were going to put it away. It's past 6 o'clock. Put it away. Or I'd text her and I'd say, oh, I really need to get this thing done and I want to do it. And maybe if I just do that. And she'd say, no, remember you said you were going to close that laptop at 6. And she helped me be accountable in the very beginning when it was really, really hard. And I slip up from time to time because I want to say it was just like 2 weeks ago. She was like, get off the computer. And I was like, oh, you're right. I hadn't done that in a while. So an accountability partner can help you break those bad habits when you're setting boundaries. And like I said, realistic boundaries. It wasn't realistic that I wasn't going to do anything. But what I could make realistic is 6 o'clock is my cutoff point. And that's where I started. That was my starting point. I was being realistic. 6 o'clock was my cutoff. And I had somebody to help hold me accountable to that. And that made a huge difference in my success in setting boundaries to where I don't even have to think about it anymore. I just enjoy my life and I enjoy my new routine and enjoy being present with my family. I enjoy sitting down for dinner and I don't look at the computer. I don't do work stuff after 6 o'clock. And actually that boundary grew. Because see, once you start setting those boundaries, then they grow. And so I was actually able to capitalize on more time at home later on. But that was a start for me. So you started small, you enlisted that accountability partner, whoever that may be. It can be friends, family, somebody from your teacher tribe, and you began this journey with your small steps. The next thing to do is think about that big picture and those steps that you're taking. So that was my process, right? We talked about my process a little bit so far. I took off that work email from my phone. Then I decided at 6 o'clock every day that computer was closed. I did, and that was weekdays. I didn't address the weekends. That's all I addressed. That's it. I was still working on the weekends, on Saturdays for much of the day. And Sundays, if you go to my Life Work Balance series, you can see kind of what I started with. But Sundays I had always reserved for one of my hobbies, which was crafting. So because I was trying to get my life in balance, it kind of eliminated that whole work boundary thing anyway, because getting my life into balance meant focusing on one of my hobbies, and I reserved that for Sunday. So Sunday was already reserved for something else. But I was still working on Saturdays. I was still working till 6 o'clock every night, even Fridays. But big picture for me was not working outside of my contracted hours. So I started with my small steps and I had an accountability partner. And so then my boundaries began to grow. And so that's what you're going to see. And that's what's really important, is to grow your boundaries. And like I said, it doesn't happen overnight because you have to get systems in place. So I said, okay, I'm going to designate one Saturday. So for my school, we do 6 weeks, some do 9 weeks. And I love to plan far in advance. And I have a planning system that I use that's very systematic and very targeted. So I told myself, okay, my next boundary is I really don't want to be doing this on Saturday anymore. But to do the planning I want to do so that within my contracted hours, when I'm actually planning the really in-depth activities and things like that, all of my pre-planning, I'm going to pick one Saturday before the 6 weeks starts. So on the last week of the 6 weeks, that Saturday, I sit down that whole day and I go through my process and I get all of that out of the way. But do you know what that means? That means I'm not spending every Saturday trying to catch up on plans. That means I'm not constantly feeling behind. I have a lot of stuff done ahead, and the other stuff that I need to put into that, or the differentiation I need to do based on the skills that we're doing, and that's a whole nother thing. And that system I could talk about, like that would take a long time to talk about. But that went into setting a boundary that even though it was still after my work hours, it wasn't every Saturday. And I made the decision on how I was going to dedicate my time to give me more time for other things. So I put that in and that worked. So big picture, that's what I wanted. Big picture is because I have that system in place, I no longer have to work in the evening and the weekends. There are a few days I might come in, but actually now my computer's closed by about 4:30, if that. There are so many days I don't even open up my computer anymore after work. But I started small. And that's what you need to do, start small and build, and you're going to start learning systems to get in place. And remember how we were talking about, that time, looking at your time, eliminating, consolidating, letting go of things. All of that stuff came into play while setting these small boundaries along the way, because as I was setting them, I was still thinking of those things. How do I do that? And coming up with systems to where the majority of my work is done during contracted hours. And finally, you need to think about what is non-negotiable. There have to be things that are just non-negotiable when you're setting boundaries. So outside of work, it's non-negotiable. If there's something going on with my family, I'm sorry, I'm not going to volunteer for that job fair that you have this weekend. It's just not negotiable for me. And you have to make that stance. Some things that are non-negotiable for me are that email on my phone. I'm not going to answer your email once I leave and I'm not, on that work computer. If an email comes through, sorry, that's just non-negotiable. I'm not going to put myself back in a situation where I'm constantly tethered to work. What is not negotiable for you? So you have to think about those things in your boundaries. Like, it may be non-negotiable for you to do anything on Sunday. For me, that was a non-negotiable. So what does that mean for you? What does that look like for you? Because remember, we're building here, but we have our small steps. But when you're thinking big picture, when you're thinking, what do I want these small steps to lead to? Think about those things that are not negotiable for you. That no matter what, you're not going to be guilted into, pressured into, forced into doing. What are your non-negotiables for your boundaries outside of your work hours? And really hold on to those. And then just continue to build. That last step is continuing to build. It may seem daunting because we have a daunting career. And things that are placed and asked of us to do are and can be considered humanly impossible. Continue to build those boundaries outside of work, reclaiming your time. It's a process. Hold on to it and don't let go, and don't get, pulled back into all of those myths that we've talked about. Be empowered to stay in those boundaries. Be empowered to keep creating those boundaries and doing those things. Just continuing to build. You know, I always go back to that saying, Rome wasn't built in a day, and it wasn't. And I know it's an old saying, but it wasn't. And my boundaries were not built in a day. I still had a very consumed life with my teaching career outside of work hours, outside of actually teaching, for quite some time. I mean, I started so small with just email. This is something that's taken me years to perfect. But hopefully, the process that I went through can help you get through it a little bit faster, so that you don't have to do this for years at a time. Because when I first tried to start setting boundaries, I didn't have an accountability partner. I didn't have somebody who could hold me and say, no, that you said you were going to shut that laptop. Like, I didn't have that. If you have that accountability partner, you're going to get through this whole setting boundaries things a lot easier, a lot smoother, and a lot quicker. So these are things that I learned along the way in a very long journey of setting boundaries to now where I feel very free and I actually enjoy my job a lot more. I'm more refreshed as a teacher because I have set these boundaries, and I've learned that I'm still effective at my job, but I don't have to do it all the time. So you can have boundaries outside of work, and you can continue to build on those boundaries as you go. So we've talked about how you deserve boundaries when you're off. We've talked about how to be realistic. And now we're going to talk about the most important thing, which is letting go of guilt. Guilt is mental manipulation. There is a myth that if you're a teacher and you have boundaries, you are only in it for the paycheck and you don't care about your job if you set boundaries. That myth is a mental manipulation to get you to do work outside of work hours, to get you to do things that you shouldn't be doing. That is something that really bothers me as an educator. That myth that you don't care, you do. That is mental manipulation to try to get you to do things outside of your boundaries. You deserve a life. You did not take a vow to only educate. You did not say, I vow to dedicate my life to education and education only. That is not what you did. Education is only one aspect of your life. It can be an important aspect of your life, but it's not the only aspect of your life. And you can care about more than one thing. Being an educator is serving others. I truly believe that. You serve as an educator, but you did not give your entire life over to service. Your career is a career that revolves around service. But you do deserve to have a life, and you can be passionate about education. I am so passionate about education. I live and breathe for education. I love education. It's the heartbeat of me. But you know what else is the heartbeat of me? I'm a mother, and I'm a wife, and I like to have hobbies and craft, and I love to write, and I know it's weird, but I like to clean, and I like to organize. Like, that is all things that are passions of mine. You can love and care about your students and your school community, and you can also love and care about all the other aspects in your life. I just really want you to think about that and hold on to that. I think that's so important. You're no less of an educator if you love other things too. If you're passionate about other things too. If you give your time to other things. You're still just as great, just as effective, and just as caring an educator. So today was a lot to take in, and we're going to go ahead and wrap up. Remembering that you can set boundaries when you're off, that your boundaries need to be realistic and they will grow over time. and that you can let go of all of that guilt that comes with setting boundaries and that is placed on you when you start to set those boundaries. So let's go ahead and wrap it on up. You can be effective and have boundaries. You can be an effective educator while still having boundaries outside of work. Boundaries can force change. If enough teachers set boundaries outside of the working environment, the system is going to have to change. What they put on us is going to have to change. It's only because we continue to do things outside of contract hours and work exuberant amounts of time outside of our contract hours, and they just keep throwing more on us because they say, well, they're going to keep doing it. If educators as a whole start setting more boundaries, it's going to force change in educational systems of what they're actually putting on us. Boundaries are a sign of productive mental health. Having a boundary and sticking to it and not letting anybody mentally manipulate you into doing things that go against your boundaries show productive mental health. And always remember, an exhausted educator is an ineffective educator. So many times, administration and those around feel like if you are not constantly exhausting yourself, then you're not giving enough. But you know what? If you're exhausted, you're not effective. The educator who has boundaries, the educator who is well rested, who has good mental health, who has productive mental health, you're more of an effective educator than somebody who doesn't know when to turn it off. Because you actually have the energy, you're going to be present with your students, and you're going to be able to actually give them more when you're rested and have those boundaries. So thank you for joining us for part 3 of setting boundaries. In your workbook, you can go in and you can journal about the boundaries you're going to set, how you're going to stick to them, how you're going to evaluate them, but remember to set them, that you deserve them. And I feel like I'm just going to stress it one more time. You do not have to work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to be an effective educator. You can be an effective educator when you have healthy boundaries both at work and outside of work, and you can do it. And it is important, and you are worth it. And it doesn't mean you don't care. It doesn't mean you don't love your students. You can love them just the same. The love we have for our students doesn't change because we have boundaries. Boundaries are important. Setting those boundaries and starting those boundaries are important. Join us next week as we conclude our series on just a very short conclusion on setting boundaries and checking back in with you. I can't wait to see you guys next week. Dive into that workbook and start setting your boundaries, your personal, outside of work boundaries. I can't wait to hear about the boundaries that you set and how they have changed your life and how they have increased your energy, your motivation, and all of the benefits that it brings. I can't wait to hear you guys share your success stories about setting boundaries outside of work. We'll see you guys next week.